It started with two scathing tweets fired off by Donald Trump on Air Force One, just hours after Justin Trudeau gave his final remarks at the G7 summit. Well, today, the attacks on the Prime Minister got even nastier. Katie Simpson leads off our coverage.
Odd man out.
The president's top advisors added insult to injury. On the Sunday morning talk show circuit, Donald Trump's senior aides delivered a scathing message to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, hours after the U.S. pulled its support from the G7 communique.
He really kind of stabbed us in the back. He really actually, you know what? He did a great disservice to the whole G7.
There's a special place in hell for any foreign leader that engages in bad faith diplomacy with President Donald J. Trump and then tries to stab him in the back on the way out the door. That's what weak, dishonest Justin Trudeau did.
Trump appears to be offended by Trudeau's response to U.S. tariffs imposed on Canadian steel and aluminum. During the Prime Minister's closing news conference at the G7 summit, he called the justification for the economic punishment insulting.
Canadians were polite, we're reasonable, but we also will not be pushed around.
But it is unclear why Trump is angry now, because Trudeau has said this before.
Prime Minister, what's your reaction to President Trump?
Today, Trudeau ignored reporter questions about the insults, instead sending out the Foreign Affairs Minister to try to de-escalate tensions.
Canada does not believe that ad hominem attacks are a particularly appropriate or useful way to conduct our relations with other countries.
Chrystia Freeland didn't sling any mud, insisting that actions are more important than words.
Our retaliatory tariffs will come into effect, perfectly reciprocal, perfectly measured, a dollar-for-dollar response on July 1st, which is Canada Day, perhaps not inappropriate.
Trudeau's inner circle is going to keep lobbying the White House and U.S. lawmakers in the hopes of getting Canada an exemption from the tariffs. But some of those conversations are going to be so much more uncomfortable because of this new level of hostility. Katie Simpson, CBC News, Quebec City.
Trudeau's approach to Trump and trade certainly has been criticized by the opposition in the past, but after the strong reaction south of the border today, big names among Canada's Conservatives lined up behind the Prime Minister.
I don't understand the obsession with, trade relations with Canada.
Stephen Harper saying that Trump's focus on Canada made no economic sense. The leader of the opposition, Andrew Scheer, talked about presenting a united front on NAFTA.
It's certainly not helpful to have that type of language.
And newly elected Ontario Premier Doug Ford tweeting that he's standing shoulder to shoulder with the Prime Minister. Well, our Ottawa Bureau Chief Rob Russo has been working the phones today. And Rob, what have you heard from Canadian officials?
Well, let me take you back, first of all, to 5 p.m. on Friday in Charlevoix, okay? There's a bilateral meeting at the end of the first day of the G7 summit between President Trump and Prime Minister Trudeau, and it's going so well. People are very excited. The Prime Minister's key advisors are there. Larry Kudlow is there. They're talking trade. Steve Mnuchin has been working the phones. He's not there working the phones with Finance Minister Bill Morneau. How well is it going? Trump has been asking for a sunset clause. At one point, he waved away the notion of a sunset clause, surprising his own chief negotiator, according to people who were there. And people think it's great. Next thing they hear at the end of this summit, they're having a little celebration at the end of it all when the tweet is read out to them. And their reaction, Ian, is this has got to be a parody tweet. They didn't believe that it was actually real. They had to check. They checked and found out it was real, and then realized at that moment that they were in a dangerous parallel political universe and had to jump into action.
So then they have to figure out what their strategy is going to be. Tell us about that.
Yeah, the first thing they did was make some calls, some very quick calls, and some very interesting people on the other end of the phone. They called Doug Ford's people, for instance, right away to let them know about this, because this represents a mortal threat to the manufacturing base of Ontario in the auto sector, these threats to put in tariffs. And so they got quick reassurance from him. They reached out to Brian Mulroney, veteran of trade discussions, tough negotiations with the U.S. president. And he gave them some advice. And then they swung Chrystia Freeland into action to try and depersonalize it, take it away from the Prime Minister, while reiterating the same arguments that the Prime Minister had made a day earlier.
We have seconds left. That tweet, very public, very personal in its attack on the Prime Minister. Have you seen anything like this before from a U.S. president?
No, I haven't. I mean, there have been ugly moments, but it's always been private, never so pointed, never so public, never so aimed directly at a Canadian chief executive of a government either. It is unprecedented in the public way and in the personal way that President Trump went after the Prime Minister.
Rob Russo, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
So personal, public, unprecedented. Trump's tweets and the flurry of comments from top advisors definitely sent a message to Ottawa, but what triggered them?
I highlighted directly to the president, made it very clear to the president. It's what I explained to the president. It's kind of insulting. We're polite, we're reasonable, but we also will not be pushed around.
It's fair to say Justin Trudeau's words had some edge, but perhaps they shouldn't have come as a surprise.
Let me be clear. These tariffs are totally unacceptable.
Trudeau's been pretty much saying the same thing for days in U.S. media.
The idea that we are somehow a national security threat to the United States is quite frankly insulting and unacceptable.
In fact, that national security justification has been a Trudeau talking point since the last G7 a year ago.
That suddenly trade in steel between Windsor and Detroit might be a national security issue is just silly.
But back then, Ottawa was still on a charm offensive.
We are going to have a great relationship with Canada, maybe as good or better, hopefully, than ever before.
But the tone has changed. And if we're to take Trump's tweets at face value, clearly something about the content or the timing stung.